And we know that your spirit sits with us in our meeting today. Um, I know one of the great pleasures of my professional life was to work with Martin uh, in a repeat of conversations that we might have tonight. It's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marta Estellés, who is an extraordinary academic I've had the pleasure of working with over a number of years, and she too is at the University of Waikato. And it's because, really, in many ways, the delightful, challenging, perceptive article that was published in The Conversation earlier this year on assessment that the collective decided that it would be really useful to put their thinking out to a wider audience tonight. And Lynda Stuart is someone who needs no introduction. The Tumawaki of the Great May Road School, former president of NZEI and cherished member of the Mount Eden Gorgeous Pizza group that we frequent on a regular basis. It's always lovely to see you, Lynda. Keep fighting the good fight as you always do. Now, there's an opportunity for people to make comments. We've got a group of people, including the famous Liam Rutherford in the back, collecting comments as we go along. So please, comments, questions, and the plan is that we'll open the meeting up for those conversations to become part of what we're going to do tonight. The format is we're going to ask Marta to start first with a PowerPoint presentation and a discussion of her research around assessment, and especially the impacts around national assessments and the kinds of ways in which it looks like this government in fact, has moved already. And then an opportunity for some comments through to Jade and Lynda for an opportunity to talk about her experience as a principal. Um, I don't know, I guess everyone's saying Groundhog Day. And sometimes I sort of feel like I've woken up in the middle of Groundhog Day, that I thought we won some battles once before. And getting to an age where I sort of feel that going to have to do it all over again. And I think one of the really truly exciting things is to have two young up and coming scholars like Marta and Jade willing to pick up the cudgel and to take the fight on, and to take the fight on behalf of Tamariki and Rangatahi, and also Kaiako, who will be required to do a range of things that may be counter to the philosophical beliefs that we who hold dear the ideals of the progressive movement in education struggle with. And although we've traversed much of this in the past, the new proposals that seem to be, and the new directives that are guiding the way in which the minister and the ministry is working, requires, I think, a new look. And so I'm going to pass over to Marta to speak to um, the changes which are facing us as a schooling education sector. Kia ora, Marta.
Kia ora, Peter. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to really thank the Aotearoa Educators Collective for organizing this event, and in particular to Liam for inviting us to participate in this crucial conversation. I'm going to be up front here. I am not an expert in assessment. I do research in education policy, and I guess for anyone who knows a little bit about education policy, they know that that this is not just another education policy. It can have far-reaching consequences, and as many of us know as well, this is not just an education policy, but I will talk about this in a minute. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So before I just want to give a quick overview of what I will be talking about here. So just a quick introduction of what is this policy about, why this policy, and finally what are the effects of standardized assessment, looking at examples from overseas, and in particular the UK, the US, and Australia. And then my colleague Jade will specifically focus on the Aotearoa New Zealand context with the national standards experience. So just a bit of context, this policy is part of a broader policy called Teaching the Basics Brilliantly, that aims to reach 80% of Year 8 students at or above the expected curriculum level in reading, writing, and maths by December 2030. This policy has been quite famous because, among other things, it has mandated 1 hour per day of structured reading, writing, and maths. But I guess another arm of this policy that perhaps hasn't been that discussed is that it will make standardized testing compulsory for year 3 to 10 students. And because of that, the ministry, in March this year, the ministry issued a tender to buy an assessment tool. And I brought here a couple of quotes from that tender because they are quite representative of the rationale behind introducing this standardized assessment. It is presented as a long-term solution and as a means to inform decisions at different levels for teachers, for parents, and for the ministry. In many senses, this policy seems like a reboot of the previous national standards, as Peter said before, and my colleague Jade will talk about this in more detail later, but I wanted to highlight here a couple of main differences between these two policies. One is that for the former national-led government, national standards were a big part of their election campaign, while in this case the policy has arguably been introduced by stealth, with the quiet release of a tender and some partial announcements here and there. And the second main difference is that national standards were basically based on teacher judgments and not on a form of national testing like the one we have now. The rationale at that time was that these teacher judgments were trying to avoid the problems that other countries were already experiencing with national testing. But I guess the research that was funded by the government at that time repeated several times that the data reported with the national standards was not reliable enough because there was too much variation between teachers in the ways that they had used the standards. So the government this time preferred to opt for a more reliable standardized testing approach, which already brings us into the why of this policy. But I wanted to broaden the debate a little bit here and unpack some of the broader ideological, political, economic, and sociological reasons behind this policy. So if we start with the ideological, this has to do with the prioritization of neoliberal ideas, such as the exercise of parental choice. We want parents to have comparable data available so they can make decisions around which schools. We want to foster competition between schools. And for all that, we need accountability measures like standardized assessment. And obviously, these ideals are prioritized over others, such as equity, equality, public education, democratic curriculum, or whatever. And the other ideological reason that I think has been quite important in this policy is this meritocratic ideal that education can help individuals overcome their social and economic barriers. As Nicola Willis put it, education is the great liberator and the great equalizer. I would love to be able to ask Nicola Willis if what she thinks by this is that the poorest 50% of the New Zealand population who only shares 2% of the wealth, what they need to be amongst the 5% wealthiest is actually education. But this, in the end, this democratic ideal serves as a rationale for the government to put their efforts into education rather than in other socio-economic areas. And this is why I was saying before that this is not only an education policy, it is also a policy that puts pressure on the school system to correct social inequalities. This policy is also about control. It gives governments more external control and surveillance over schools and teachers with a relatively hands-off approach. What colleagues have called staring at the distance. And in relation to the economic drivers, I think here the notion of social investment approach is very important, is this idea that governments need to find more reliable measures to target, in brackets, reduce social expenditure to those areas in which resources are most needed, or those in which the government will really get a return on investment. And this is here is a report from 2016 by the right-wing think tank, the New Zealand Initiative, in which they were pushing for this sort of approach, and the government in New Zealand has been following this approach in quite a few other policies. The problem with this approach, as our colleague Professor Martin Thrapp said, is that this often implies the quick trial and discard of interventions when we know that educational interventions need actually more time. And perhaps more importantly, that this approach is often used to address specific risk indicators rather than looking at the overall context of deprivation or poverty, because obviously it's cheaper to look at those specific indicators. My colleague John O'Neill and I have also argued elsewhere that this approach has also served as a way to shift away from the provision of fully funded education for all. So yeah, these are only some of the consequences of that approach. There are also sociological reasons behind this policy. The ministry is concerned with the so-called PISA slide, and a very particular reading of these results, again, highly influenced by the New Zealand Initiative, that considers that the reason for this slide is a very loose curriculum. But as I said, this is a very selective reading of PISA results. PISA has obviously other findings that the ministry doesn't want to hear about. For example, that socioeconomic status is the best predictor of academic performance, something that, yes, it is also the case across the OECD. But what the government forgets is that other more equal countries or countries with less poverty, they overall have much better results. So a good way to help schools and students could actually be to improve social and economic policies rather than focusing on a standardized assessment. But again, that's a result from PISA that the ministry is not interested in. Another important sociological reason is that this kind of accountability policies or testing regimes have been part of what has been called the global education reform movement. And New Zealand seems to want to follow what some of these countries are already doing, or have already been doing for a few years now. And this is the case of the US, the UK, and also Australia. So the good thing is that we can learn from these countries on the effects of national testing, and I will be talking about this briefly in the next few minutes. So if we look at the case of England, for example, they introduced their key stage tests in 1991. They have had multiple changes over time with periods of more intense testing, but overall continue with several tests across the primary years. What research has highlighted here in relation to achievement is that there were early gains at the beginning, but then they plateau after a few years, which has been arguably or has been interpreted as a result of teachers getting better at teaching to the test, but then reaching that threshold that actually you need different policies to increase that achievement. Initially, the target that was set was 75 and 80%. of students achieving level 4 in numeracy and literacy, respectively. And that was the target that was expected by 2002. We are in 2023, and the percentage is only 65%. Results have highlighted a gap between the poor and the middle classes. Again, not surprise. Some positive effects that teachers and students now have a clearer idea of the performance standard expected at each level. But overall, most of the research have highlighted to lots of unintended consequences. Creation of league tables, narrowing of the curriculum, teaching to the test, decrease in student motivation, labeling of children, and impact on their identity as learners, fabrication of results, which is not prevented with more standardized testing, increase in stress and anxiety for teachers and students, intensification of teachers' workload, pressure on schools to recruit bright middle-class children, etc. And perhaps because of this, all these unintended consequences, these tests have faced considerable resistance from both teachers and parents, with multiple boycotts over time. In the case of the US, the Bush administration introduced the No Child Left Behind policy, which had a strong test and punish approach, and also pay performance and all these things. They had the goal of achieving 100% of student success. Of course, they never got, and newer policies with the Obama administration have softened a bit the approach, but continued with a strong focus on standardized assessment. Research has found little relationship with student achievement and similar unintended consequences to those found in the UK. Other important findings that this testing, national testing, or standardized assessment has been a door for private actors to get into the public education, and particularly private corporations having a big role in defining what standards were, and also these tests and so on. And in some a bit more crazy, if you like, results of state manipulation of tests scores to justify policies like charter schools, to funding more charter schools. And again, these unintended consequences have triggered the reaction of several students, parents, and teachers. In New York State, for example, the opt-out movement was a parent-led movement to boycott these tests. And in some parts of the New York State, more than 50% of students did not attend those tests. And finally, the Australian case with the National Assessment Programme, which again shows very little improvement in student achievement over time, and lots of unintended consequences, including less attention for students who need extra support, students with disabilities, students with English learners, migrant students, and so on, and also the creation of league tables, despite efforts from the government to avoid them. Large studies on teachers' views have shown very clearly that teachers don't see value of these tests. And other important findings have been that they have seen a continuous decline of participation, particularly from low-performing schools, and the growth of a test industry or other edu businesses that are offering services to schools to increase their performance in those tests. So what we have in here are a number of very damaging effects of standardized assessment, some of which are more obvious and visible than others, but they are equally problematic, particularly because the hidden ones tend to have a more enduring impact in the education system. So as a final remark, I just want to say that we know that this policy is going to fail, based on what we know from other countries and what we know from our own country, as Jade will show. But what we are not sure is if politicians are going to be held accountable for this. What we know for sure is who are going to be the ones paying the consequences of these policies, who are going to be our schools, our teachers, and our children, who are precisely the ones who need most those policies that are different and that have other reasons to be. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for your attention.
O ngā mihi a koe, tō rangatira, Marta. Thank you for contextualizing the policy shifts and changes. Now's an opportunity before we move to Jade for people who wish to put some comments or questions up. I see Carolyn's already done that, and there are others. I was struck that there's economic, political, philosophical, and sociological reasons for the policy, but I struggled to see any educational value or purposes, and we know this, and this is nothing particularly new. But I struggle when the government talks about knowledge-rich schools, that there seems to be a lack of knowledge for the minister about something which has been patently clear for many, many years. And I think the important thing for me, Marta, was when you signaled that this isn't national standards 2. This is ratcheting it up another level. And that I remember very clearly Mary Chamberlain at the time, who was responsible for instituting national standards, saying, we haven't gone down the national testing route because we know that's a failed policy. And now, nearly 20 years later, we're somewhere else.
Yes, that's very true, Peter. And I think that's partly the reason why they haven't been that upfront about the policy.
No. Look, there's a whole range of other questions for me. Not only why this policy, but why now? And we'll come to that maybe a bit later on. How does it fit within the wider agenda that they have for schooling? And I think you certainly touched on that with the economic, political, philosophical, and sociological backing which sits behind that, which seems completely devoid from anyone's experience of what a school in New Zealand is. But maybe we'll open that up. Jade, I know that you work closely with Martin, and Martin's work looking at the impact of national standards on schools. I remember a number of years ago, with the change of government, Ministry of Education officials wandering around the country apologising to teachers and principals for the appalling impact of national standards, and claiming, as they usually do, oh, well, we're just following what the minister said. But, the reality now seems to be, well, now we're going to roll out something else that we know is pernicious on the cultures of school. Jade, we're really interested in knowing what your research has been telling us, and it's up to you.
Kia ora, Peter. Tēnā koutou. It's such a pleasure to be here today with everyone. Today, I'm going to just give you an overview of what I will be presenting, and that is, firstly, well, what is national standards, and what impact did this policy have, and then looking at, how this tool would be different. So Marta did a fantastic job of giving us that international context around research, and what it really highlights is that there's a lot of similarities between international research and the New Zealand context, which gives us a really good idea of what this policy might look like. So firstly, national standards introduced by the National-led government in 2008. These standards set out the expected levels of achievement in reading and writing and mathematics. And these were based around an achievement target of having 85% of children achieving at or above for reading, writing and mathematics. The thing is that this policy required teachers to make a professional judgment against a 4-point scale. Now, this 4-point scale was had these labels of above, at, below, and well below. and each child will be labelled as to how they were achieving against the standard in reading, writing and mathematics. The problem is that this reinforced a hierarchy of subjects in the curriculum where value was attributed to subjects based on whether they were assessed or not. And as a result of that, we had uninterrupted class time being allocated to numeracy and literacy. And this was often in the mornings where children were alert and focused, whereas non-assessed subjects, things like the arts and health and physical education, were either omitted entirely or just pushed to the afternoon, where children were tired and unfocused. And it's important to note that this impact was really intensified in low socioeconomic schools. And in middle class schools, they generally speaking were able to enact a somewhat more broad curriculum. And so this had really significant implications in terms of social segregation. And I'm glad, Marta, that you brought that quote up at the start around education and Nicola Willis's comments around that, because we know that these policies impact some communities more than others. In terms of the narrowing curriculum, 67% of principals indicated that national standards narrowed their curriculum. Similarly, 69% of teachers agreed with this statement. There have been various studies conducted that show the impact of national standards, specifically the arts, health and physical education, but also on science. And it's interesting to note that on average, only 6% of classroom timetables were found to be dedicated to science. But this also resulted in teachers being de-skilled and de-professionalised. So firstly, we had advisory services for learning areas outside of numeracy and literacy being abolished. There were limited opportunities for professional development. So, for example, in the arts, this meant that teachers lacked the skills and knowledge to teach the subject, and therefore they didn't. In my own research, I discovered that teachers couldn't remember the last time they had taken professional development for the subject of music. One teacher even indicated that this was during their initial teacher education 15 years ago. And lastly, Darren Powell found that because teachers weren't being given the opportunity to teach these other areas of the curriculum, they weren't given the opportunity to upskill through professional development, they felt that they were unable to teach it, and as a result, outsourced those learning areas to private companies. Now, the problem with that is that some of these companies didn't necessarily have knowledge and expertise in education. They didn't know the children that were in front of them, which can be really problematic. Now, we also know that we have teachers leaving the profession and that we have a teaching shortage. So it's really interesting to see the flow-on effects and what that looks like in terms of the bigger picture of the profession in New Zealand. These overall teacher judgments, however, labelled children. It's really important to note, I talked about that 4-point scale of above, at, below and well below, that the at was set to a higher level than what was being expected. And this was described as being inspirational. But what happened was that children who were achieving at the curriculum expected standard suddenly were positioned below, despite the fact that their achievement, their learning had not changed. The other thing to note is that these overall teacher judgments were inaccurate. They didn't provide an accurate depiction of what a child was learning, nor what they were achieving. They were one teacher's opinion, and although these were moderated, there was a lot of inconsistency between teachers, schools, and also classrooms. But by labelling children, it opened up the door to grouping them according to their ability. And we have colleagues that have worked very closely in looking into the implications for streaming. And we know that this can have really serious consequences in terms of how children view themselves as learners, but also for our Māori learners. And are we putting them into the well below groups because we're deficit theorising what their achievement is rather than where they're actually at or what they're capable of. We also saw something called data walls starting to emerge. Here are the data walls. So in classrooms or staff rooms, you would have displays like this. And I want you to draw your attention down to the bottom left where you see this very long road and you can see these cars positioned in different places on the road. Now, each of these cars represents a child, and this road represents where they are achieving. So children at the, towards the front, the start of the road are achieving highly, and children at the back are achieving poorly. And I would really question you to reflect on what would it feel like to be one of those cars sitting at the front of the road versus what it would feel like to be one of those cars at the end of the road. And what impact would that have on you and your own identity as a learner? So what did parents say about this? Well, one study found that national standards did prompt a conversation with a parent about how their child was achieving that might not have happened otherwise. Some teachers did also find that national standards were motivational, that they provided more of a focus around achievement. But it's important to note that this came at significant consequence. And so here is a quote from one parent who shares that their child was positioned below, but they hadn't shared that with him because if he heard that message, it would stunt his growth. And you can see here the parent said, he would read that and say, yeah, I am stupid. That's what the other kids told me. And this is the type of impact that it can have. What about the children? What did they say? Well, we've talked about streaming, and this was an interview with a child who was in a classroom that had different groups for mathematics based on their ability. And this child shared that there were 3 different groups. There were circles, triangles, and squares. The interviewer asked, well, which group are you in? And the child said, well, I've been in circles and I'm in triangles. I'm currently in circles. And then the interviewer asked, well, what is the difference between circles and triangles? And the child said, well, circles and triangles, not much, but squares, they just do what they're told. Sometimes they go on the mat. So even when we're not thinking about these consequences, we know this has a real impact on children, and they're constantly observing these dynamics, and we have to think carefully about what the hidden curriculum is in our classroom and what messages are we unintentionally sending. We also saw the establishment of league tables. We had data being published and schools were ranked against each other. The problem, well, one of the problems with this was that parents saw this data as reflecting the quality of each school, even though we know that socioeconomic status continues to be a significant influencing factor of the level of achievement. And because of a school's position on a league table, that would impact their reputation and therefore the number of enrolments that they had and the overall number or amount of funding that they received. So what did principals say? Well, one researcher explained that only a few principals think of the standards as robust or providing a valuable record of student learning. Most principals oppose national standards. Only 26% said that they actually provided a valuable picture of learning. 74% of principals additionally said that national standards didn't support children with disabilities or any additional learning needs. What about teachers? Well, 70% said that they were inaccurate. 73% again said it didn't support children with disabilities or additional learning needs. Only 16% of teachers felt that national standards had actually positively impacted student achievement. And 60% of teachers shared that national standards had increased their workload and that it was more work for very little gain. By 2017, what was really interesting is that achievement data had actually declined under the national standards policy. And we saw teacher unions coming together and saying that this policy is causing damage. We also saw national protests throughout the country coming together, highlighting the impact that these policies have. So to give you a summary, while national standards did have some positive impacts, these were significantly outweighed by the negatives. It's important to note that overall achievement data declined. It didn't improve achievement. Simply weighing the pig doesn't fatten it. Data was additionally inaccurate and inconsistent. League tables were created, reinforcing competition between schools. Children were labelled and streamed according to their ability, which had a negative impact on their identity as learners. Children with disabilities weren't supported. A hierarchy of subjects in the curriculum were reinforced, and the curriculum overall was narrowed, which meant that also the knowledge and the skills that children had access to was also narrowed. We know that the workload of teachers increased, teachers were de-skilled and deprofessionalised, and that the majority of the profession opposed national standards. So what I ask is, how will this tool be any different? And so when we look at national standards, there was this argument saying that the curriculum wouldn't be narrowed because evidence of progress should be drawn from all areas of the curriculum. Under the Teaching the Basics Brilliantly policy, we know that the statement has come out saying that schools are expected to develop a balanced curriculum on all learning areas of the curriculum. Despite this, our Prime Minister has described subjects excluded by this policy as an extra and a nice to do, clearly reinforcing that hierarchy. In terms of league tables under national standards, the Education Minister at the time, Anne Tolley, indicated that the government would not create league tables, later described these as inevitable. Interestingly, the Education Minister, Erica Stanford, has similarly said it's not our intention to pit schools against each other. So if we look at the targets, well, national standards driven by this target of 80% of children by 2017, but we see that the data in 2017 clearly shows that children were not meeting that target. So I ask this, will children be reaching the target of 80%? I would say it's very unlikely. And to conclude, my final thoughts. There has been no consultation with the sector. There have been no reports, briefings, or emails, or any written advice from the Education Review Office. This has been conducted in a very short time frame, 3 months, for the tool to be purchased from an overseas business and then be adjusted to make it relevant to the New Zealand context. We're also putting the cart before the horse. The assessment tool will be in place before the new curriculum has been written. This isn't evidence-based nor research-informed, and what we know from assessment data is that what this will do is lead to a narrowing curriculum, a pressure to teach, memorization tactics, and even a fabrication of results. And so I leave you with this quote from the late Professor Martin Thrupp. The more managerial and performative pressure that is placed on teachers, the less authentic their teaching will become. And I would say truly, if we want to keep children, tamariki, at the heart of our education system, then this is the last policy that we should be introducing. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Jade, for that powerful and illuminating and at times quite distressing account for those of us who lived through the nonsense once before. Someone wrote that those data walls made her heart ache, and I just thought of my granddaughter being one of those cars on a road and what that would mean for her at 6 years old, and the dehumanizing aspect of this chills me. And Francis has commented, certainly brought back some very bleak memories. Richard's asked to hear some of the thinking from supporters of both national standards and standardised testing. It's very difficult to find an academic and education outside the New Zealand initiative, and one would query the academic status of those in the initiative who support this this kind of policy.
And just to add to that, Peter, I want to say that Marta and I, it was really important for us to provide a clear picture of both the pros and the cons of these types of policies. So we did really try and highlight that. But again, there wasn't a lot of literature
There isn't. No, I mean it's extraordinary. It's um, Mariah has noted that Christine Ruby Davies' research also shows OTJs underestimated Maori and Pacifica children by up to 2 years. The impacts of these kinds of policies and reinforcing disparity, inequity, those kinds of things, and the damage that this sort of thing happens. Lynda, I'm going to turn to you, and you lived and opposed national standards. I remember as part of your role in the union and as a Tumawaki. I've got two or three questions I'm just going to ask you for if not a one-word answer, just a very brief answer before I move on. In your schools, are your teachers already assessing and reporting effectively?
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Of course they are. Of course they are, Peter. They're doing this all the time. And as I talk through what I want to say, I guess that will become clearer and clearer and clearer. I sat there listening to this, the presentations, and thank you, Jade, and thank you, Marta, for telling our realities. It made me really sad. And it made me really sad preparing for this. So it's a great privilege to be here, but telling the story of the reality is actually a sad one. And throughout the time I've been listening, and throughout the time I was digging out some of the notes from 2012, I was thinking, why on earth would we go there again? Why would we do this again? Many of us saw the seeing off of national standards in 2017 and 2018 with a sense of hope for the future, and that looking towards an education system that was focused really on knowing the learner, understanding their background, knowing their language, their culture, their identity, understanding their families, and using effective strategies to meet them where they are and to take them to the next steps of their learning journey. And you know something? New Zealand teachers have been renowned for doing this world over for years and years and years. We've been known. In fact, if you go overseas and you're a New Zealand teacher, one, you're snapped up. Two, you are treated like a rock star.
So, Lynda, the minister wants us to be world leaders in education. Do you think she doesn't
We
realise
are.
we already are?
We are. Just listen to us as people who do know what we're doing. You know, what we do is we use formative and we use summative assessment to look at where those children are at, and we plan their next learning steps for them. We've always known, Peter, that each child is individual, they're unique. In fact, anyone that's had more than one child as a parent knows that every child is different and they will learn differently. We know this because as teachers, we talk alongside them. We're always constantly making those judgments around where those learners are at within the curriculum and what their next steps are. So a snapshot or a standardised assessment in time is not going to cut the mustard.
I always remember, and I wrote an article at the time, a media piece, which was the trouble with national standards is there's no such thing as a standard kid. And I think that's part of the problem. In fact, if you look right across everything this government's doing, there's a one size fit model for everything. Here's the textbook, here's the maths that we're going to do, here's the structured literacy approach. We're not doing this. We're going to take away highly performing maths programs to Reo Maori programs because we've got this one size fit, especially if you can buy it from overseas.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, as I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about my time of leading a school during national standards, all I could think of was that it was just so hard, particularly in a community like the community that I was leading. So Decile 1 school, largely Māori, largely Pacifica, the children bring so much with them to school, with their language, their culture, and their identity, and so do their families. And the one thing that I really loved about it was they bring their trust. And imagine what it was like and how I felt as a leader when we were told that instead of valuing the children for their language, culture and identity, we would instead measure them against what Jade was talking about, that well below, at and above. And we would report on that to their parents. You know, schools like mine, we tried to mitigate against that. We did as much as we possibly could. And as a school, we joined with, and I know Francis is online at the moment, we joined with other schools. There were 300 of us, I think, that were in the Boards Taking Action Coalition. And what the government did was they picked us off one by one until people became, except for a small handful of people, became compliant around it. Now, I would hate to see that sort of behaviour happen again. The minister at the time, as Jade pointed out, said, you know, when national standards were first introduced, we won't do league tables. However, the media can get the data because it will be in the public domain. So, of course, league tables eventuated. And what happened was exactly what Jade and Marta have pointed out, is schools were ranked basically around their national standards data.
Really, schools became those data walls. That where was May Road on the, and decontextualized as a car on, compared with Auckland Grammar or whatever. I do also remember Anne Tolley naming Martin Thrupp in the House. And it was one of the most appalling attacks on an academic I've ever witnessed in this country. The question I have is, the nonsense of it coming back, but coming back in a more virulent form as national testing is one thing, but it's wrapped up in a whole range of other agendas that have been pushed through by the minister, on the advice of no doubt of the MAG group or the MAGA group. The thing about that, it seems to me, is that this orange shock approach, which is to hammer schools with as much as you possibly can. There was a significant fight back by principals and schools and said, look, we're not taking this. We know this is nonsense. We know this is hurting our kids and our communities. Does the minister in this government think if we hit them hard enough with enough stuff, they'll just collapse?
I can't ask or speak for the minister, and I wouldn't even go there, Peter. But what I can say is I saw something that one of our Aotearoa Educators Collective people put out in the last couple of days, and it really resonated. And it really, I think it just sums it up, really. When we know better, we must do better. And this is from Sarah Iono, and she often puts out blogs and things that I think are really insightful. And she talks about educational malpractice, that it doesn't require malice, it only requires silence. Educational malpractice when professionals implement or comply with pedagogy that they know to be developmentally or ethically inappropriate, often due to pressure, and in doing so risk harm to children's learning, well-being or identity. We're at that time now, and so I guess this is why I see this as so important. We've learnt stuff in the past. In fact, not only have we learnt it in our own country, but we've seen it in countries overseas. And I think when I think about decisions that we have to make as professionals, we have to keep our children at the forefront of our mind. And what is the thing that we're seeing at the moment? So we're seeing a whole lot of policy announcements, including the latest ones around attendance today. And yesterday we had more support for maths. We've had $26 million on maths textbooks. And I think, often those decisions can be great decisions if you're actually prioritising what really matters. And what really matters at the moment, in my view and in the view of many of my colleagues, is the dire need that we have in this country for significant investment for those children who have learning support needs. That's what people are crying out for. They're not crying out for maths textbooks. They're not crying out for standardised assessments. And actually, with the standardised assessments, we've got PAT, we've got STAR, we've got something called Ed Potential that the Manaiakalani Outreach use. And that stuff works. We can use that as part of the picture around a child's learning. We shouldn't even be thinking about going overseas and spending money that we really need in our schools to meet the needs of our schools. And the thing that I would say, while I've got this time,
You keep going, Lynda. Who would I be to try and stop you?
actually, when at all have we ever been asked? Ask us and we will tell you what we need. We need support for our children, not assessments for our children. We've got those. We can use those. Give us the support that we need. Give us the people that we need. Give us the psychologists, the counsellors that we need for children who have anxiety and trauma. Actually listen to what we have to say, because it's dire out there. And our teachers are doing their very, 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 very best.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
Thank you, Lynda. Look, lots of people are saying, well said, exactly. I often think, national testing regimes are around lack of trust and the professional nature of teachers, I just don't buy into the argument that New Zealand teachers aren't. For me, New Zealand teachers are amongst the very best in the world, and we have the capacity to return to one of the best education systems in the world, but not through the current changes which are proposed. I want to flick back to Jade and Marta, and just for either one of you to make a comment on what Lynda has said as a principal who's lived through a version of this in the past and is concerned about what she's now going to be required to do as a principal.
Yeah, I think Lynda pointed out something very important, and you too, Peter, which is that this trust on teachers. We really know, we don't need a test to actually know what teachers need, or what, every single principal in the country knows who are the students that really need support, and teachers the same. And the ministry is being quite smart at framing this policy as a way of supporting teachers, and as a way of almost taking workload out of teachers, and something that will be much easier for them than those overall teacher judgments that require lots of paper. Well, if we look at the evidence overseas, again, it has required, it has intensified workloads for teachers. And in general, it just keeps reinforcing this idea that that teachers shouldn't be doing, shouldn't be exercising their professional judgment, and we give them resources, we give them a structural literacy approach. So basically, they start, thinking less and less in the end. I was in a conference last week for teachers, and it was very interesting because there were lots of workshops by private providers that they were offering. All of them were offering private resources for teachers. And the whole message that was sent out there was like, no worries, you don't need to think. The most important thing is that all the teachers, all the research have done all the research for you, and now this will be ready for you to go. And how dangerous is that? We actually should be doing policies that will give teachers more time, because that's what they are really needing. They are really putting time. And that will be the key to have a better education system, really.
Thank you, Marta. Jade?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really wonderful, rich kōrero. I guess the thing that I keep coming back to is, what is the purpose of this policy? We know that socio-economic status and that relationship with achievement, and if we want to raise achievement, why aren't we investing in the policies that target that inequity that we face? Why are we simply measuring and simply testing? And the argument behind that has been, well, we need more data. And I would say, well, we have a lot of data. You know, we know that the vast majority of schools, even prior to teaching the basics brilliantly, were using forms of summative assessment, but also formative assessment that continues to inform their practice. And then the second argument behind this policy is that, well, we need the data to know where to put the resources at. And I would say, well, we know where to put the resources at. This is why we have an equity index system. This is why we do the census. We have this data. So why are we not addressing these things? Why are we nitpicking at the side of the system rather than having a fundamental change of the system? And my last comment I just want to say is that with all of these changes, I keep coming back to Roger Douglas. And he had that famous quote, Roger Douglas. He had that famous quote after Tomorrow's Schools saying that what you need to do is be strategic, work so fast so they won't have time to mobilise. And I think that's the message that I'm playing in my head when I see all of these changes. Yes, I think that's something for all of us to think about.
Yeah, so neoliberal awe and shock. It's an old trick. They've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. Look, you know, time is up. We're right at the hour mark. I wanted to thank all three panelists. Lynda, do you want a final? Look, we've got 15 seconds for a final word. No, you're not. No, can't possibly do it in 15 seconds. I just wanted to say thank you to all three of you for a really rich, informed conversation. It's one which we need to be taking into schools. We need to be taking and having with our parents, with our members of parliament, to be doing that work. Please make sure that you listen in on the kinds of things which the Aotearoa Educators Collective is involved. Someone, I've just scroll back to it, Lynda has reminded us of the Beyond Capacity Learning Support and Crisis Report going to Parliament on the 20th of May, and to be involved in that. I thought I'd close with a poem. It's called The Data Have Landed. First, they said they needed data about the children to find out what they're learning. Then they said they needed data about the children to make sure they are learning. Then the children only learnt what could be turned into data. Then the children became data. And it's Michael Rosen. And we spent a lot of the evening talking about data this and data that and data wars. But I know this group have had at their heart our tamariki and our rangatahi. And that's what drives our passion, not the pursuit of data and achievement standards and all that other nonsense, but really at the heart of what we do as teachers in this country, teachers in universities, teachers in early childhood, primary and secondary, is to carry in our hearts the dreams, hopes and passions of the children we work with. Go well, all of those who've been listening in. And thank you once again for your participation. Marta and Jade, Lynda, ngā mihi nui a koutou. Thank you.